Hello everyone. Today we are going to be learning about the New England Colonies. In today's presentation there will be a brief history of each of the New England colonies. We're also going to be learning about the climate and the geography of this region. We're going to talk about the religion and how people worshipped. And then lastly we're going to finish it up and talk about the economy. The first colony that we're going to discuss about today is known as the Massachusetts colony. And this colony started when a small group of Puritan separatists, who later became known as the Pilgrims, first arrived in Plymouth in 1620, and they formed the Plymouth colony. And the reason why they did this was because they disliked many of the practices that the Church of England had at that time, and they wanted to be able to practice their religion a little bit more freely. Later, though, as the Massachusetts Bay Company saw that this was becoming a success, they started to give charters to other Puritan groups, and they began to expand. And then in 1630, as these settlements expanded, they became a colony officially, and it was settled by a man named John Winthrop. This decision then was able to spark a new generation of colonies that began in New England. As the Massachusetts colony started to grow, Puritans such as the Reverend Thomas Hooker thought that Massachusetts was becoming way too religious and constricting, and he grew pretty dissatisfied with the practices and the government of the Puritan church that was in Massachusetts. And so, in 1636, he helped form the colonies of Connecticut. Now, Mr. Hooker is also very famous for inspiring the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, which was one of the first written democratic constitutions that would help establish a representative government. While Reverend Thomas Hooker formed Connecticut because he thought that Massachusetts was way too restrictive in their religious practices, Puritans such as Roger Williams, who was a clergyman, was actually banished by the Boston authorities for his radical views, thinking that Massachusetts was way too restrictive. And he decided to form the colony of Rhode Island in 1636. Now, Rhode Island is famous because it was seen as a more liberal colony, and it was actually the first of the New England colonies to offer the freedom of religion. To the north of the Massachusetts colony is a land where a handful of adventurous settlers, including a man named John Mason, formed the colony of New Hampshire in 1629, when he was given a land grant from the Council of New England. And what's interesting about New Hampshire, though, is that they did not form this colony due to the desire for more religious or political freedom. They formed this colony because the area was rich in trees, so they would cut and ship this lumber back to England in return for profit. The geography of New England is very unique as it consists of mountains thick with trees inland, as well as rivers and pretty poor rocky soil that makes it difficult to farm and is pretty unsuitable for crops. The land is also pretty flat closer to the coastline. And of this area, this is the coldest of the three regional colony groups, and the temperature is usually mild, and with the short summers, it leads to long and cold winters. But fortunately for the people living in these colonies, there were less diseases than in the warmer colonies. The New England colonies were dominated by the Puritans, who were reformers seeking to purify Christianity, as they felt, and they came over from England to practice religion without any persecution. The Puritans, though, followed strict rules and were intolerant of other religions, eventually even absorbing the separatist pilgrim groups in Massachusetts by 1629. Life in New England was dominated by the church, and there were severe consequences for those who failed to attend or people who spoke out against the Puritans in any way possible. Enjoyable events such as singing, celebrating holidays were among things that were even prohibited by the Puritans in New England. Farming was difficult in New England, especially for crops like wheat because of the poor soil. But corn, pumpkin, rye, squash, and beans were planted quite successfully. So farmers would then take their goods and then travel to market towns, where they would trade their farm produce for goods and services. In New England towns along the coast and in the northern colonies, the colonists would make their living fishing, whaling, and shipbuilding, and focusing more on the industrial work. This focus allowed for these colonies, especially the coastal cities, to become financially successful with something that was called the Triangle Trade Routes. And these routes linked Britain and the other British colonies, as well as Africa, and as the 3 points of a great triangle along the Atlantic Ocean. The traders would then carry their manufactured goods from Britain and the raw materials from the colonies in the West Indies. Well, this about wraps up our presentation on the New England colonies. Our next presentation will focus on the Middle Colonies.